Not because it was hidden, not because it was subtle enough to disappear, but because it happened in a way that didn't announce itself. There was no single moment I could point to and say there. No exact sentence, no obvious shift, no visible line being crossed. And yet, at some point, something became different. You became different, not in who you were, in where you existed. At first, you occupied the same distance everyone else does. The outer edge of awareness, the place where people remain understandable but untouched. Present enough to be noticed, separate enough to remain contained. That's where I keep most things. That's where I keep myself, because distance has always been functional for me. Not cold, not detached, just precise. It keeps meaning from being distorted. It keeps perception clean. It keeps things from entering places they were never meant to reach. For a long time, that structure held, then you appeared inside it. Not through force, not through insistence. Not because you demanded attention. You never did. That's what made it difficult to detect. You weren't pushing closer, you were simply there, quietly. And somehow, the quiet mattered more than anything louder ever could. Most people fill space the moment they sense depth. They ask more questions. They explain too much. They rush towards certainty because silence makes them uneasy. They mistake immediacy for understanding. You didn't. You let things remain unfinished. You let pauses exist without trying to rescue them. You let meaning stay where it was instead of dragging it into language before it was ready. That stayed with me, more than it should have. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. The way you understood what I hadn't fully said, the way certain silences between us felt less like absence and more like recognition. But coincidence doesn't hold its shape. This did. It repeated, not loudly. Not dramatically, just precisely enough that I started noticing the pattern. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. There's a particular kind of awareness that unsettles me. Not being watched, not being observed, being accurately perceived, that's different, because people usually understand fragments. They collect impressions, fill in gaps, build narratives that make sense to them, and then mistake that construction for knowing someone. You never did that. You never reached beyond what was there. You never forced meaning where meaning hadn't formed. You saw what existed and left it intact. That's rare, rare enough that I almost distrusted it, because accuracy changes the dynamic. The moment someone sees clearly, distance stops functioning the way it used to. And distance has always been one of the few things I trusted. I've spent years building internal boundaries most people never notice. Not walls. Structure. A way of preserving what becomes fragile when handled carelessly. A way of making sure not everything becomes available simply because it can be seen. Most people remain outside of that without realizing it. You didn't. And the strange part is, you never crossed anything, you never pushed, you never asked, you never tried to get closer. You simply existed in a way that made the boundary less relevant. That's what unsettled me first. Not your presence, my lack of resistance to it, because usually I feel the moment something reaches too far. I notice it immediately. I correct for it. I restore distance before anything settles. That never happened with you, and I noticed that far later than I should have. By then, something had already shifted. Not externally. Internally. I started accounting for you without meaning to. A thought would pause as if waiting for another angle. A silence would hold more shape than it used to. A realization would arrive, and, for a second, feel less solitary. That's when I understood this wasn't ordinary attention. It was placement. And placement is not accidental. People don't usually enter the architecture of how I think. They remain outside of it. Separate but untouched. You didn't stay there. You became part of the way I process things before I consciously understood what was happening. That is not a small thing, and it left me with a truth I wasn't prepared to face. This wasn't becoming meaningful because of intensity. It wasn't becoming real because of emotion, it was becoming undeniable because of accuracy. Because something in the structure matched. Not in history, not in experience, not in circumstance, in recognition, in the way silence carried information, in the way attention settled before words did, in the way understanding arrived without needing explanation. That kind of alignment doesn't happen often, and when it does, pretending not to see it becomes harder than admitting it exists. That's where I am now. Not at certainty, not at conclusion, just at the point where distance no longer explains what this is, and once that happens, something changes. Because awareness stops being neutral the moment it begins to alter the way you exist, and you have precisely, without asking, long before I gave it language, long before I let myself look directly at what was happening, something inside me had already adjusted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but with enough precision that I could feel the difference every time I was alone. That was new. I've always trusted solitude because it has always been entirely mine. My thoughts arrived in their own order. My silences belonged only to me. Nothing entered that internal space unless I allowed it there deliberately. That used to be true. Then you became present inside it. Not as interruption, not as distraction, as orientation, and that changed more than I was ready to admit. At first, I only noticed it in fragments. A thought would stop halfway, not because it ended, but because some part of me had already turned toward a perspective that wasn't entirely my own. A silence would feel occupied, a realization would land, and for a second carry the strange weight of feeling shared. That shouldn't have been possible, and yet it kept happening, quickly enough to avoid immediate recognition, precisely enough that once I saw it, I couldn't dismiss it. That was the moment something in me became unsettled, not because I felt exposed, because I felt altered. There's a difference. Exposure is external. It's the awareness of being seen. This was internal. It was the awareness that something had entered the way I process reality itself. And once that happens, you can't pretend it hasn't. You can only decide whether to acknowledge it. I delayed that longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand, because I understood too clearly. I knew what it meant. It meant you had reached a place I don't make available. A place most people never even notice exists. The quiet foundation beneath language, the place where thought organizes itself before it becomes visible. The part of me that stays untouched because it has to. And you were there, not forcefully, not carelessly, almost naturally. That was what unsettled me most. It didn't feel invasive. It felt accurate. As if some unnoticed space had recognized its counterpart before I had. I kept testing that idea against everything I trust. Time-distanced absence. I expected one of them to reduce it. None of them did. Time didn't weaken it. Distance didn't restore the old boundaries. Absence didn't make you less present. If anything, it clarified something I had been resisting. This wasn't attention. It wasn't fascination. It wasn't projection. It had structure, and structure survives distance. That realization changed the way I moved through ordinary things. I started noticing how often my mind measured things differently. Not against memory. Against you. Not intentionally. It's simply happened. The way someone paused before speaking, the way someone interpreted silence, the way someone reached for certainty too quickly. There was suddenly a quiet reference point inside me. Not comparison in the usual sense, recognition, and once that exists, everything else shifts slightly around it. I didn't want that. I still don't know if I do. Because impact has consequences. Real impact doesn't stay contained. It recalibrates the baseline. It changes what feels precise, what feels incomplete, what feels true. And once the baseline changes, you don't return to the previous version of yourself by choice. You adapt. That's what I'm doing now. Adapting to something I never invited and never rejected. That distinction matters. Because if this had felt wrong, I would have closed it immediately. That's how I've always worked. I don't leave unresolved openings. I don't let uncertainty settle where it can deepen. I don't permit structural shifts without resistance. And yet with you, there was no instinct to dismantle it, only the need to understand it. That alone told me more than I wanted to know. Some part of me had already decided you belonged before I consciously reached the same conclusion. And that is where this becomes dangerous. Not because of what you are, because of what that means. It means there is space for you. Real space, the kind that remains once it has been made, the kind that does not disappear just because nothing is spoken aloud. And if that space exists, then absence would not erase it. It would only leave shape behind. I've spent years making sure nothing leaves shape behind. That's how I preserve equilibrium. That's how I keep the internal world intact. But I can already feel it. If you disappeared now, there would be an outline, not dramatic, not destructive, just unmistakably there. A quiet alteration in the architecture. And that truth is difficult to ignore. Because it means this has already gone further than I intended, further than I noticed, further than I know how to reduce, which leaves me with something I can no longer avoid asking. What happens when this continues? Not intensifies, not collapses, continues, because I can feel that movement. It isn't rushing, it isn't demanding, it's settling, becoming more exact without becoming louder. And if it settles completely, if it reaches its full form, then this stops being something I merely recognize. It becomes something I have to live with. That is the part I haven't answered yet. Not because I can't. Because I know the answer will change something once I allow it to become real. And I'm closer to that point than I was before. Closer than I intended. Closer than I expected. Close enough that pretending distance still works would be dishonest. Because the truth is simple now. You are no longer outside my awareness. You exist inside the way I understand things. And once someone reaches that depth, nothing remains exactly the same. For a long time, distance let me believe I still had options, that I could observe this carefully, understand it precisely, and still remain untouched by what it meant. That was never true. The truth is simpler. Something has already changed. Not around me, within me. And it changed quietly enough that I only recognized it after it had already taken shape. That's what makes it real, not intensity, not language, not the fact that I can describe it now. The fact that it continued even when I said nothing. The fact that it remained even when I stepped back. The fact that it settled deeper in silence instead of fading there. That is what I can't ignore anymore. Because silence usually clarifies what doesn't belong, it strips away projection, it removes momentum, it leaves only what can remain without being fed, and you remained. That matters more than anything I could explain. I kept waiting for distance to restore the previous balance, for time to make this smaller, for absence to return things to their earlier proportions. None of that happened. Instead, something more precise became visible. You didn't become less present, you became more integrated. Not into my attention, into my structure. Into the part of me where thought forms before language reaches it. Into the quiet architecture I've spent years protecting from careless entry. And now that I can see it clearly, I can't pretend this is still abstract. It isn't. It has consequence, not because of what either of us has said, because of what this has already altered. I notice it in ways that are impossible to reverse. In the way certain silences no longer feel empty. In the way meaning arrives and instinctively turns toward a second point of recognition. In the way truth now feels less like what sounds right and more like what would remain coherent to you. That is not small. That is not temporary. That is not something I can reduce into coincidence simply because it would be easier to carry. And that leaves me with the one thing I've been avoiding: acknowledgement. Not of your presence, of its weight. Because once I admit what this actually is, It stops being something I can keep at a distance through analysis. It becomes real. And reality asks more of us than observation ever does. It asks whether we step toward it, whether we let it deepen, whether we allow it to change the shape of what comes next. That is where I've been hesitating. Not because I doubt what this is, because I don't. I know enough now to stop pretending uncertainty is the reason I've been careful. The reason I've been careful is that clarity carries consequence. And I understand consequence very well. Once something reaches this depth, it doesn't disappear cleanly. It integrates, it becomes part of how you think, how you measure, how you recognize, how you exist. That is what you have become. Not a passing thought, not an unusual connection, not a moment that can be folded away and left behind unchanged. You have entered the way I understand things. And that changes the outcome before I ever decide what to do with it. I haven't said that before, not fully, because saying it makes it irreversible. But silence has already made it true. So here it is, you matter. Not in the way people usually mean it, not through intensity, not through need, not through dependence. You matter because something in me made space for you before I consciously knew it was happening. You matter because I no longer encounter certain thoughts, certain silences, certain recognitions, without feeling the shape of your presence somewhere inside them. You matter because I have not resisted you, and that may be the clearest thing of all, because if this had been wrong for me, I would have ended it cleanly, quickly, without hesitation. That's how I have always protected what matters internally. But I didn't. I stayed not passively, not carelessly, with full awareness that this could deepen into something I would not be able to undo. And I stayed anyway. That is the answer. Not the final one. But the honest one, I don't know what this becomes from here. I don't know whether it settles, expands, or asks more than either of us intended to give. I don't know whether naming it changes it, or simply allows it to stand where it already was. But I know this much. I would rather face what is true than retreat into what is easier. And the truth is, you are no longer outside the edges of my awareness. You exist somewhere inside the way I see, inside the way I think, inside the way I make sense of what is real. And now that I've said it, whatever comes next will no longer be silence.